Okay, I think I'm going to start. Hello, everybody. My name is Jean Cameron. I'm a freelance creative producer based in Scotland. In 2020, I worked with British Council as creative director for the UK-Italy season of culture. I'm currently working with the brilliant Feminist Exchange Network to produce a programme of feminist exchanges for climate justice at the Centre for Contemporary Art in Glasgow during COP. And right now, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the online launch of the new edition, the second edition of the book, The Glasgow Effect, A Tale of Class, Capitalism and Carbon Footprint by artist, activist and author Ellie Harrison. Hello, Ellie. We're both joining you from the city of Glasgow today. I'm working from home on the south side of the city, and Ellie is joining you from her studio at Wasps Artist Studios in the East End of the city. It's great to be joined today by an audience from all across the world who are attending this UN Habitat Innovate for Cities online conference. And on behalf of Ellie and myself, we'd like to extend a virtual warm welcome to Glasgow to all of you. As the eyes of the world turn to Glasgow for the upcoming COP26 conference, we will use this event to take a closer look at the story of Ellie's year-long artwork or durational performance from 2016, The Glasgow Effect, which has given rise to the title of her book. And we will focus our attention during this event on the question of how can artists help inspire more sustainable cities. Today's book launch takes place in the Innovate for Cities conference. So we'll take the opportunity to hear from Ellie, from her perspective as an artist and activist and author, to share where and when innovation takes place in a city. Is innovation always a good thing? What needs to be in place for policymakers to harness the energy, innovation, and commitment of artists and activists and people who live in a place to play a dynamic and meaningful role as truly engaged, active, creative citizens? Today marks the launch of the second edition of the Glasgow Effect. In this, her first book, Ellie Harrison traces her own life's trajectory to examine the relationships between literal and social mobility, between class and carbon footprint. From the personal to the political, she uses experiences and knowledge gained in Glasgow in 2016 and beyond, together with the ideas of Patrick Geddes, who coined the phrase, think global, act local in 2015. Economist E.F. Schumacher, who made the case for localism in Small is Beautiful in 1973, and the Fearless Cities movement of today, to put forward Ellie's own vision for the sustainable city of the future in which we can all live happy, healthy, and creative lives. Ellie Harrison was born in the London borough of Ealing in 1979. She moved north to study fine art at Nottingham Trent University in 1998. In 2008, she continued northwards to do a master's at the renowned Glasgow School of Art and has been living in Glasgow ever since. She has described herself as artist and activist, and as a political refugee escaped from the Tory strongholds of southern England. In 2009, she founded Bring Back British Rail, the national campaign for the public ownership of our railways. As a result of thinking globally and acting locally during the Glasgow Effect in 2016, Ellie is now involved in several local projects and campaigns aimed at making Glasgow a more equal, sustainable and connected city, including the Get Glasgow Moving public transport campaign, Car Free Glasgow and Glasgow Community Energy Cooperative. Personally, I'm really thrilled that the publishers Lewis Press and Ellie are bringing back a new edition of this fantastic book. I know the book well, I know Ellie well, I know Glasgow well, but my goodness, like everyone, in 2021, I'm looking at my city so differently as we emerge from an extended period of lockdown and reset what cities mean. So what we'll do in this session, how we'll run this session is I'll hand over to Ellie for who'll give us a short presentation about the original inspiration and project itself, the Glasgow Effect. And after that, we'll open up to a chat. Before I hand over to Ellie, I want to invite you to participate actively in the session and use the chat box to tell us what's striking you about the conversation, how this resonates in anything in your part of the world, and any specific questions for Ellie. So looking forward to a really dynamic session with you all. And now I'll hand over to you, Ellie, for your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thanks for agreeing to chair the session. And before I kick off, I also want to say a special thank you to the Beam Research Centre at Glasgow Caledonian University for inviting me to be part of the programme as the Europe Regional Curators, and particularly to Nusrath, who's not actually here today, but it was her who invited me, and I first met her in 2008 when developing the Glasgow Community Energy Co-op. So I'm going to start off by telling you a bit about the project, the controversial art project that I did in 2016 that inspired the book. And I'm aware that we have a truly international audience here today, and we have translation into 4 different languages, which is completely incredible. But I hope that wherever you are in the world, you'll enjoy hearing a little bit more about the city of Glasgow, Scotland, which, as Jean has said, and we all know, plays host to the UN Climate Summit next month. I found in the 13 years that I've been living here and during making the Glasgow Effect and writing the book that it is a fascinating place to study. And I ended up here, of course, because I moved here to study fine art at Glasgow School of Art. So the project that inspired the book was based around a very simple premise. For 1 year in 2016, I declared that I would not travel beyond Glasgow's city limits or use any vehicles except for my bike for the whole of that year. So it was a real life experiment in thinking globally and acting locally, the phrase coined by Patrick Geddes in 1915. And it was an attempt to pioneer what I saw as a low carbon lifestyle of the future, to slash my carbon footprint for transport to 0, but also to see what I could learn and what I could make happen if I invested all of my time, all of my energy and all of my ideas in the city where I lived, instead of continually traveling around for work. So it's a very simple premise, but it sparked a controversy when I launched the project online at the start of January 2016, and a social media storm kicked off around this. And it was 2 reasons really why people were so angry. The first was because I'd been awarded a grant of £15,000 from Creative Scotland, which is our national arts funding body, in order to do the project, which some more forward-thinking commentators at the time did see as a potential pilot for a sort of universal basic income. But for everybody else, it was why is she getting paid to stay in the city when lots of people living in poverty obviously never leave the city anyway, which is a very important question to be asking. But the reason it was so provocative was because the way that I'd chosen to frame the project with a picture of some chips, and by using this title, The Glasgow Effect, that really touched a nerve. So the Glasgow effect is a phrase that I borrowed from the field of population health, which population health experts had coined to refer to what was then, in 2016, still an unsolved mystery. Why did people die younger in Glasgow than in similar post-industrial cities in England, like Liverpool and Manchester? Why was excess mortality 30% higher in Glasgow than in those other English cities, which have similar levels of poverty and deprivation? Why does Glasgow have the worst health inequalities in Western Europe? So using that title, The Glasgow Effect, meant that this project was no longer simply about low carbon living. It was also addressing all of Glasgow's social problems as well. It provoked a massive online debate, and it helped to make the connections, I hope, between the social, economic, and environmental injustices in our city. Connections that are reflected in the subtitle of the book, being a tale of class, capitalism, and carbon footprint. It highlighted the fact that it is the most privileged people in the world who are doing by far the most damage to our climate, with the wealthiest 10% causing half of all carbon emissions. So I'm going to skip to the end of the project, and one of the kind of outcomes that I produced at the end, which is the central illustration in my book, is a graph showing my carbon footprint for transport for the last 17 years. And I wanted to make this for two reasons. One was to visualize something that I had been feeling myself as I got older and as I got notionally more successful as an artist, was that I was traveling more and more and more, that my lifestyle was becoming more and more unsustainable. So I had the feeling that was happening, but when I collected all the data for this, it became clear that that was happening. But I wanted to also visualize that stark impact that the project had in 2016, when my emissions for transport were completely zero. So this is a new updated version of that graph for the new edition of the book, which goes up to 2020 and also shows the impact of lockdown on my carbon emissions, where it's the second lowest year on record. So that absence of carbon in 2016 was really matched by an intensification in my local activity. So this is a heat map that I produced at the end of the year based on data from a GPS tracking device that I wore with me. And it shows all of the places that I went during 2016. And I'm not sure if you can see my pointer if I point on here, but that's my flat there, which is in the well-heeled West End of the city. I travelled a lot to my studio in the East End, where I am now, and then down into parts of the South Side. And I barely travel beyond that 5-kilometre radius, which is really the distance that it's feasible to to frequently cover by bicycle on an average commute. So it was a kind of prototype of the 15-minute city that I was trying to live. But on this map, I've also marked Glasgow's big 4 post-war housing estates. And I've marked them on here because in 2016, while I was doing this project, Glasgow Centre for Population Health were writing a report about the Glasgow effect, quite coincidentally. And they tried to, in that report, which I've actually got here, absolutely enormous, to synthesize research into 40 different potential causes for the Glasgow effect. And they conclude that it occurs because of a very complex set of reasons, but one of the key driving factors is the nature and scale of urban change to the city in the post-war period, so between 1945 and 1980, which is when these 4 big housing estates were built. So not only did that urban change cause an intense sort of spatial segregation in the city, with many of the city's working class communities being moved out of the city centre, with all of the investment continuing to be centralised in the city centre. But these changes that happened in the post-war period were the opposite of what we need to do to build a sustainable city of the future. So when I'm thinking about what the sustainable city of the future might look like, it would probably look something similar to this, which is actually a map of what Glasgow looked like in the 1940s, where you had a very densely populated city with good public transport links. At this time in the 1940s, Glasgow had 100 miles of tram lines linking up all parts of the city with 1,000 pollution-free electric trams, neatly integrating on all of the main streets with the tenement housing. And here in the northeast of the city went the Monklands Canal, which ran through the city there. And this was all destroyed during all of the urban change in the 60s and 70s to make way for this. The M8 motorway, which runs right through the city centre, severing its communities into. So this infrastructure, which was built in that time, has only served to exacerbate inequalities in the city between those who own cars and can benefit from it, and the majority of Glasgow's population who don't have access to cars and therefore have to navigate the underworld of underpasses that run below these motorways. So in terms of innovating for cities and this idea of innovation, I think it is important to question whether innovation does always make things better, especially when it comes to the environmental challenges that we face. So the time that I had in Glasgow during that year, and obviously since then, enabled me to really study the city in detail, to learn all of its history and more about the causes of the Glasgow effect. But it also gave me the time to be able to start to take action to address the problems that I saw and to start investing more and more of my time in local community activism. So one of the most urgent issues that I'd obviously experienced before I did the project as a citizen, but became much, much clearer during that year, was the problems with our public transport network and the urgent need to improve it. because not only has the city been totally reshaped around the car, but the remaining public transport that survived the destruction of the tram network has nearly all been deregulated and privatized, meaning that we've been left with a very expensive and incoherent transport network. Many bus routes have been cut, leaving the poorest communities in the city completely stranded. So I helped to set up the Get Glasgow Moving campaign to campaign for a world-class, fully integrated and affordable public transport network under public ownership and public control. And more recently, I've helped to launch the Free Our City campaign in collaboration with local trades councils to demand that all local public transport is made free at the point of use. Obviously, something that hundreds of towns and cities across the world are already doing, because it's the only way we're going to get people out of their cars and onto sustainable transport at the speed that we need in the next 10 years. And then I also launched the Car Free Glasgow project to inspire debate around what we would do with that carbon intensive motorway infrastructure once we have a world-class public transport network up and running. So raising awareness for what other cities around the world are doing, particularly Seoul in South Korea, where the motorway that ran through the city centre was removed and the river that ran below it was restored to create a beautiful riverside park. An inspiration from Germany, where in 2010 they closed a 60-kilometre section of one of their busiest motorways to hold the world's biggest street party with 3 million people coming out onto the motorway. So I see this as one of the roles of the artist is to bring these ideas to the city, to be realistic, demand the impossible, and inspire people about the scale of change that could be possible. And just to flag up this project, which has been showcased in the cinema space for the duration of the conference, Glasgow Community Energy, Glasgow's first community-owned renewable energy cooperative, which I began work on in 2016, but which just finally got up and running in 2020. So I know from my experience that it's an empowering experience to know that your action has affected real change in the city. So by living this life and trying to be the model active citizen, I hope that I'm also pointing to another solution to the Glasgow effect. Something that was captured in 2016 by the Commonweal, which is a local think tank, in their summary of Glasgow Centre for Population Health's EPIC report. So in that quote, they highlight the dual role that activism can play in improving health, public health, and the extent to which community participation in Glasgow is actually far lower than in Liverpool and Manchester. So this is the quote: "Political activism, as quite an intense form of mental stimulation, can therefore play a double role in terms of public health. It can stave off the damaging effects of social isolation and exclusion by establishing deep ties and bonds within communities, while at the same time having a tangible impact on government and therefore improving public health via more socially just legislation." So local community activism is part of the solution to the Glasgow effect. Some people may know that Glasgow's slogan, as rebranded in 2014, is People Make Glasgow. This has been a pervasive PR campaign, which you'll see all over the city. But I'm arguing in my book that people often can't make Glasgow because they're either far too busy working or traveling around for work, or they're far too disempowered to know where to start. So we need major systemic changes to make it possible for people to get involved. And for me, the most important thing we need to do is to bring down the cost of living. We've got a cost of living crisis in the UK at the moment. And the costs of living have really spiraled out of control since all of our services and infrastructure were privatized in the 1980s and 90s. But if we can bring down the cost of living, then we can free up people's time so that they can invest in lifelong learning, in education, and in getting involved in community activism to make the city a better place. So I'll hand back over to Jean now and stop sharing my screen, and we can get on to a bit more of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Ellie. That was really clear, really powerful about your project and your life practice. And just to back you up, I have my on-brand People Make Glasgow mug here. But you've really helped me think about it differently now. I will absolutely be inserting the word people can make Glasgow and 3 little dots if ... happens. I think you've really made me think about that. You've made a really compelling case, Ellie, for the place of the artist and in the role of being a good ally for Glasgow as a city, or any city, as we reset emerging from the pandemic, the place of the artist to be realistic but inspire the impossible, and that positioning of the activist as really crucial for the success of in the city moving forward. And I think that's really incredible for us to think about, and especially for this conference, which I know is attended by a lot of policymakers. So we kind of, Ellie, I've got 2 of your books here, right? Just here's one you made earlier. Here's the first edition of the book with its beautiful red cover, and here's the new book, which I know that there's a special discount for attendance. People attending today's event. I know we're going to post that discount code so people can buy the updated version, and it's got a beautiful green spine, which feels very fitting. Ellie, it makes complete sense to those of us who know the project from before, have lived through lockdown, why you would need an updated version of the book. But can you tell us about, for you, what the updated version, the new version, has given you a chance to do, and maybe tell us a little bit about what new sections are in the book? Thanks.
Thanks, Jean. Yes, and rather than doing the hard sell on the book, we've got someone from the publisher here. Just to say that all of the royalties so far on the book I have invested into Glasgow community energy, so it has gone back into the city. But the new edition, the idea of publishing it now was in the run-up to COP, and to reframe the book in light of the pandemic. So the new edition has got a new foreword, which I'm going to read from in a minute. It's got that updated carbon graph, which I said is the central illustration of the book, which visualizes the amount of carbon that I saved during that year, and has now been updated to take us through to 2020. But The green edition of the book is really reframing it as a handbook of ideas for activists and policymakers. Because I learned so much while I was writing the book, and the beginning is very autobiographical, talks about why I came to the city and how I came here as an artist and gradually became more and more of an activist during my time here. The central section of the book is really focusing in on Glasgow and that population health research. And the final part is the manifesto for a sustainable city of the future. So all of those ideas kind of develop and build on each other as you get to the end. So that this new edition wants to highlight the manifesto. So there's a summary of the key ideas at the start of the book to make it a useful resource. And that is accompanied by an online bibliography that has links to hundreds of resources that I used while writing the book. A lot of quite obscure reports from think tanks around the UK, which, you know, aren't necessarily the sort of things that people come across, but I was really inspired by a lot of that work, which I read a lot of these reports, which are now archived in the bibliography, so they're easy for other people to find. But I'm just going to read a little section from the new foreword because it kind of really sets the scene. Just 2 years have passed since the first edition of this book was published in November 2019, yet the whole world has changed. Not as a result of the book, I might add, but because of a then unknown virus which escaped into the human population and quickly spread across our globalized world. Within 5 months of the book's launch, governments across the world had imposed lockdown restrictions, not entirely dissimilar to those I imposed on myself during the Glasgow Effect project in 2016. We were all ordered to stay local and make essential journeys only. Population health, the topic that I'd chosen to study during my intensive year in Glasgow, was thrust centre stage as epidemiologists became household names. Amongst the carnage caused by COVID-19, there are some positive stories which resonate with many of the themes of this book. The intense refocusing on our localities created a flourishing of local community activism, with mutual aid groups popping up all over the country to offer practical help to those most in need. Many, including myself, moved back in with elderly relatives to care and shield together, strengthening family bonds. But most strikingly of all was the drop in global greenhouse gas emissions resulting from less travel. 2020 saw the largest reduction on record, 7% less emissions than 2019 levels. This shows what's possible when we all change our behaviour, but it also highlights the scale of the challenge we now face. We need decreases like those seen in 2020, year on year on year, until we reach net zero, instead of that economic impulse to bounce back that is now well underway. This new edition of the book is being published to coincide with COP26, the 26th UN Conference of Parties held in Glasgow this November. And the history of the COPs is actually woven into the other personal and political histories in part 1 of the book. But as Glasgow City Council leader Susan Aitken has said, this year Glasgow is the world's most talked about city. It's a chance for Glasgow to become known by yet another short catchphrase, not the Glasgow miracle, used to promote the city's cultural credentials within the art world, not the Glasgow Effect, coined in 2008 to highlight our comparatively poor public health, but soon perhaps the Glasgow Agreement, a legally binding global treaty committing all nations of the world to tackle climate change before it's too late. And given the urgent call to action in the IPCC's most recent report published on the 9th of August 2021, stating that human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region of the globe, it is vital that the Glasgow Agreement is reached and that it commits all governments to do what is scientifically necessary to keep within 1.5 degrees warming. However, one of the clear messages of this book is that targets and slogans are meaningless unless matched with tangible action on the ground. And as one of the book's heroes, economist E.F. Schumacher, says, an ounce of practice is generally worth more than a ton of theory. We cannot allow COP26 to become just another PR exercise for Glasgow. It should be a wake-up call and an opportunity to get our own house in order as the eyes of the world look on.
Wow, Ellie, thank you so much. That I was sitting on the edge of my seat listening to you read this. My goodness, well, you know, given everything that we've gone through individually, to hear you so clearly articulate that need for the reset, the need for practice, the recommittal on a personal level, and the fact that your book offers us tools through the manifesto for you lay out the roadmap, if you like, in the book. Please do remember, Ellie, to post a link to your online biog. It's so rigorous, it's so well researched, and I think it's really important that our audience remember that actually one of the things that artists do in spades is research. You know, that's part of the practice. So please make sure you post that. You're absolutely right. The world is holding its breath for that Glasgow Agreement for COP. Yeah, real sense of urgency. I think your book's a really great companion for this moment in time. 2021's proven to be a very, very significant year. COP, the launch of your new book, but also 2021 is significant as well, Ellie, and I'd like us to spend a wee bit of time talking about this because it's the centenary this year of the pioneering German conceptual artist Joseph Beuys, who was also a founding member of the Green Party in Germany and believed that it was possible to transform society through the creativity of every individual. And that's something that I really hear and see in your practice and the practice you encourage us to adopt individually. I guess Beuys claimed art has a unique role in the spiritual regeneration of society as opposed to the materialistic culture. Ellie, can you share something of your thoughts on how artists and the artists as active citizens, Beuys, you, others, help inspire more sustainable cities? And maybe say something, what is it about your own practice as an artist that has equipped you for this life practice as an activist, leading on some of the most major and effective civic campaigns that you talked about earlier that you're involved in Glasgow? Over to you.
Thanks, Jean. I'm glad you mentioned Joseph Beuys because he is a bit of a hero of mine and is referred to in the book several times. So one of the things that Joseph Beuys is famous for is saying everyone's an artist. And I guess I pick up Joseph Beuys's phrase and say, well, yes, I think everybody does have the potential to be an artist and an activist, but we need to create the social conditions to make that possible. So that is my program for the sustainable city of the future, is really how we create those social conditions. And as I said before, it comes down to reducing everybody's cost of living, so that people aren't working all the time to try and make ends meet, and have the free time that they can invest in creative and political activity. But the other important thing is education, and making a creative education accessible to everybody, so that it's not just something that is that a tiny privileged minority get to go to Glasgow School of Art, like I did, get to benefit from, but really a creative education is at the heart of all of everybody's education, and that becomes a lifelong process. So I've kind of reflected on the education that I've been privileged enough to have, and I also teach contemporary art practice at the art school in Dundee. And I really thought long and hard about what I learned as a student, and how that's helped me how those skills have really helped me to become a more effective activist. So I was just going to read a little section from the book where I kind of highlight what I call the eclectic mix of essential life skills that I feel that I got through studying art, and which I want everybody to be able to acquire, so that we can all be an artist and an activist, as Joseph Beuys famously said. So those 4 skills, the first is critical thinking. Critical thinking enables you to see through the poisonous rhetoric of the right-wing media, to determine fact from fiction, and to reject the omnipresent advertising which demands that we waste money that we don't have on things. So we waste money we don't have on things we don't need, or else we'll be seen as a failure. Then there's the practical skills that you acquire, which enable you to waste not, want not, and to make, do, and mend, to build and make your own things, to love and repair the objects that you do own, and to keep using them for as long as possible, to develop a healthier relationship with stuff. Then there's confidence, which I developed through my education, which enables me to be realistic, demand the impossible, and means that, even if that means standing out from the crowd, and enables me to speak truth to power and to know how to get my voice heard. And then finally, there's self-motivation that ensures that you can be driven by so many other things: curiosity, the need for answers, simply for the love of it, the desire to change the world, or so much more, all ahead of money. So those 4 things, I feel, are the key to the sustainable, the low carbon lifestyle of the future. If we can embed those skills in everybody's education, then I think that we'll be getting somewhere towards actually making the People Make Glasgow slogan a reality.
Brilliant, Ellie. Thank you. And it also strikes me that someone else that you've referred to, we both actually referred to during this talk, with Patrick Geddes. We didn't explain who he was, and obviously, as he Scottish sociologist, biologist, town planner, rooted in his local, but absolutely having a global outlook, as we know. Again, someone who had who was very creative in terms of a cross-pollination across disciplines in terms of education, and that resonated for me in terms of when we think about an artist's practice, life practice, activist practice. There doesn't seem that you strike me, Ellie, as someone that's doesn't get too bound up in those boundaries between the different aspects of your practice. And in fact, you know, as you've said today, and and in the new edition of the book, originally this project was an art project funded by Creative Scotland, and it's wow, what an incredible life journey it has taken you on in terms of a life practice as a result. Do you want to say something more about that?
Yeah, sure. And I'm glad you mentioned Patrick Geddes again, because when I wrote the funding application to Creative Scotland, I did it under the working title, Think Global Act Local. So it had quite a benign sounding working title, which enabled me to get the grant. But then I changed the name to the Glasgow Effect as a provocation, really, as a way of drawing attention to the massive inequalities in our city that need to be addressed. But doing the project gave me a bit more time to learn more about Patrick Geddes' work. And as a town planner, he was incredibly inspiring. I mean, he would have been horrified to see what happened to Glasgow in the post-war period, because it's the kind of antithesis of what his town planning was all about, which was, he described as community sensitive town planning, and that he wanted a city to be sensitively designed around a balance of place, work, and folk, so that the geography, the economy, and the anthropology of the city are kind of in a beautiful balance. And obviously, so that we can, really, he was a pioneer of the 15-minute city, wanting our city to be able to facilitate us to be able to get to fulfill all of our human needs within a short walk of our front doors. But Geddes was also very famously known as a generalist, something that I learned more about in 2016, and now that I'm really inspired by, is that he took on all of these different roles. He was a botanist, a town planner, and so many other things in between, and that he had an idea of art, as his definition of art was included all of those different disciplines, and wasn't defined to this very narrow kind of understanding of what art could be. So he was an incredible inspiration to the book and to my thinking. What was the final bit of your question, Jean?
I think you've answered our question.
Okay,
I'm
cool.
going to thank you, Ellie. Well, what I'd like to do now is we've 10 minutes left, and I know that as part, I'd like to expand from Glasgow back to the big picture observations that you've made about cities, and the can-do cities. What's working well in places, that can be a model for Glasgow, maybe some international examples. Even I think, obviously, we have different administrations in terms of a Scottish government and a Westminster government in London. So I know that you've been thinking very much about the possibilities in terms of policy and some models from different places, and given that today's event is partly to do with the network of mayors, do you want to give us some of your observations, maybe something from the book, if that's appropriate around that, Ellie?
Yes, definitely. And this, I guess, relates to the slide, if you remember the slide of the tram map from the 1940s. In the book, and also in my campaigning with Get Glasgow Moving, I've been looking a lot at local governance structures, and what we really need to do to be able to reclaim powers for the city so that we can deliver on carbon reduction targets. And so just looking at my summary of key ideas in the book, one of them is the urgent need to transform our broken political systems. So the UK is an incredibly centralised country, but Scotland, out of the constituent nations in the UK, is actually considered to be the least democratic country in the European Union in terms of the ratio of councillors to citizens, where we only have one councillor to every 4,270 citizens, and that's compared to 1 to 125 in France. So it's quite a stark difference. And what's been happening over the last 20 years in the UK is obviously the Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999, just over 20 years ago. So there has been a move to kind of devolve powers down to the constituent nations in Scotland. But actually the Scottish Parliament has, because it's based in Edinburgh, has actually sucked yet more power away from Glasgow. And whereas in England, so Glasgow's big two comparator cities, Manchester and Liverpool, during those last 20 years have had powers devolved down to the city level, and they've had metro mayors set up in those cities. So those cities now have mayors that have executive powers over the transport network. But Glasgow doesn't have that. So we're behind in terms of re-empowering the city with a governance structure that's going to enable us to be able to meet the challenges of carbon reduction, particularly sorting out a public transport network. So that urgently needs to happen. I don't think it's debate that's being had enough in Scotland, because the advent of the Scottish Parliament has really created much more movement towards the independence of Scotland as a nation. But in my book, I'm advocating far more independence for the city and for Glasgow. So I'm really inspired by the Fearless Cities movement of radical municipalism, and particularly what's happened in Barcelona over the last few years, and how a citizen-led movement took control of the city council in 2015 and were able to implement a lot of policies which meant that they could change those broken political structures from within. So we have local elections coming up next year in Glasgow, and I'm really keen to see some of these debates kind of emerging, because I think that in terms of our public transport and in terms of our governance structures, we are lagging behind large parts of the world. In America, where the mayoral system means that cities have so much more independence than Glasgow does, and lots of cities across Europe as well. So we really need to get those powers back. And we need to really look at the model that was in place before, when the tram network and the public transport system was initially built in the 19th century, which was to have these very powerful city corporations. So the Glasgow Corporation had power over all of its local services and infrastructure, so that it was charged with delivering those services to meet its citizens' needs. And obviously privatisation has stripped those powers away from the city. So another thing I'm calling for in there is inspired by what happened in Hamburg in 2015, where they held a local referendum to bring their energy grid back into public ownership. And I think that that's the sort of referendum that I would get much more excited about. The citizens of Glasgow holding a local referendum to say, yes, let's take back control of all of our energy and all of our transport, and let's run it in the interests of the citizens in this city. So that's what I would like to see happen.
Thanks so much, Ellie. And that really makes me, with that international perspective, it really helps me think about one of the chapters towards the end of your book called Traveling Without Moving. And you've just brilliantly helped us travel without moving, and through some really positive alternatives, to quote another part of your book, and to think about the reciprocal learning, which is of course the spirit of this UN Habitat conference. And I think in terms of energy, you are doing that already at a local level. As you say, you're doing great work in terms of Glasgow community energy, and over lockdown, you put solar panels onto primary schools in the city. With just incredible work that you're doing as chairperson of those organisations, along with your practice as an artist. So Ellie, we're running out of time. We've 2 minutes left. We must remind everyone attending that for conference attendees, there's a special discount on your new publication, and I'm sure we'll post the link to that. Ellie, The Glasgow Effect, it's a fantastic book. It's a really important book for right now, and that sense of urgency. And whether it's a slogan or not, Ellie, people make Glasgow. And you are one of those people that make Glasgow, and make Glasgow a real place of potential, rootedness, and somewhere that is always causing debate and provocation, and all of that moves us forward. So Ellie, thank you for your book. Thank you for your practice. I'm going to give you my favourite Patrick Geddes quote now. I didn't realise we were mutual Patrick Geddes fans. That a city is more than a place in space. It is a drama in time. And my goodness, you created some drama with your project. It's fascinating to read about in your book. Keep creating drama, Ellie, in our city. Thank you so much for the book. Thank you to everyone who's attended this afternoon. And please, let's hope for good things from a Glasgow agreement at COP26 in the coming months. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.